This dive was done in August 2020, just out of lockdown, and it's one of several dives I've done over the years in Jurassic coast waters. This was in Lyme Bay, somewhere in the vicinity of Golden Cap. This was in 20 metres of water, and it shows fossils. And the fossils here were basically belemnites. Lots and lots of belemnites. The idea was to pick a target off of the Lyme Bay and Dorset coast DoRIS survey, which is a side scan survey basically, which shows you the seabed and you can pick targets off there. And the target we picked was basically this. It's a smallish pile of boulders and large cobbles, so basically a stony reef, and the idea was to survey it, and I spent 60 minutes in the water on me Todd, basically able to wander about as I pleased. And I basically went a little west or a little north of west in a fairly straight line, so started on this sort of terrain, and you can see the size of the boulders, and in a little while you'll see some of the things that I saw on these boulders. And this is Stony Reef. This is in the Lyme Bay closed area, which hasn't been bottom trawled or fished for scallops on the seabed with scallop dredges since 2008, and it's recovering fairly nicely. So in previous years, if you'd gone over this, you wouldn't have seen very much at all, but now you're seeing little things like this little clingfish, and you've got sponges here and worms and sea squirts, and this is sponges on top of other things. And here we have, further out in the dive, you can see we're starting to get patches of more sediment rather than the bigger boulders, but it's still classified as Stony Reef. And there was a lot to see here, especially once you start getting closer. This is basically a 360-degree spin to record the habitat, and this is a little way above the seabed in visibility of about 6 to 8 metres, so fairly good visibility. And even though this is in 20 metres of water, this is shot on available light, so I'm not using any video lights here, and this is again as usual shot on a GoPro. And you get an idea from that the direction in which we were heading, or I was heading. Very little current, so quite a nice, easy, gentle, relaxed dive. And you can see worm mounds, or worm generated mounds, those pale conical things in the seabed. So there's silt mixed in with the gravel and the pebbles and the boulders here. But on top of the boulders and pebbles there's quite a lot of life. But you have to get fairly close to see it. Here's a group of worm mounds. And these various burrows are going down in between the rocks that you see on the surface. A lot of the boulders and the rocks are rounded. Some of them are semi-rounded and a few are angular. Getting closer to the seabed, got a black goby guarding a belemnite, and this is further on, less rocks, and I've started seeing these belemnites. And in the latter half of the dive there were dozens and dozens and dozens of them. All different sizes and several different shapes. That one there's long and slender. Some of them are tapering towards the rear end, so away from the pointy end. And some of them were shaped like bullets, so different shapes. Some of them had parts of the phragmicone on the back end. and some of them were concreted together by various biota living on top of them. That's a phenomenon called bioconsolidation, and where a sediment is stable or metastable, this acts to clump individual parts of the sediment together, the individual clasts, the individual rocks, to make a larger, more stable whole. And this is pointing out Belemnites. There's a tapery one. And from this you can understand how many of the things there were. All over the place, possibly eroded out in the immediate vicinity. And if I was to go back there, have a closer look at the boulders at the first part of the dive and see if there are any ammonites. I did find one partial small ammonite. And here we see several belemnites, different sizes, different shapes. There's a tapery one that tapers towards its back end on the right at about 5 o'clock, a bullety one in the middle, and probably a World War II relic right next door to it, and this is exactly as found. And up at about 12:30 in the top there's a section of crinoid stem. See that octagonal section? So to sum up, this was a different dive than normal. Although we went in to dive and survey the biota, the living things, there was a lot of long dead things on this dive, which I found a lot more interesting, I must admit, than the actual living things on the second half of the dive. I rather got sidetracked. What we saw here was a stony reef and sediment. If the whole bottom, all sizes of rocks were moving, it would be classed as sediment, and that probably would have been what we would have found during the times in which this was actively fished and bottom dredged for scallops. There were quite a lot of scallops seen on this dive, but now, since it's been closed since 2008, sediment is much more stable, so most of this dive would classify as stony reef.